Welcome to Podkey Fantasy Football, where draft prices get tested harder than the hype. A lot of draft advice sounds clean until you price in what it costs somewhere else. That's really the thread today: tight ends, anchor backs, quarterback values, and all the places where the market may be telling a half-true story. The easiest tight end mistake to diagnose is drafting two expensive ones and calling it flexibility. Most of the time, it's just duplicated opportunity cost, because that second elite tight end usually comes out of the same rounds where you're supposed to be building running back and wide receiver insulation. If one of those tight ends becomes your flex, the question isn't whether he's good. The question is whether he outscores the running back or receiver you passed on, while also leaving your starting lineup thinner when injuries hit. That's why the anti-double elite TE argument is strong. It's not anti-talent, it's pro-roster structure. There is still a real case for early tight end investment in deeper leagues, or when you think the top 6 or 7 at the position create a weekly edge the middle class can't match. But even there, the logic only holds if the projection is actually durable. A player like Loveland can look like an 80-catch, 1,000-yard bet on paper, yet tight end value can swing fast if route volume comes down or target competition ends up more real than expected. The same context check applies to veterans like Kelsey. Name value isn't the same as insulated value. Age, efficiency decline, and added competition can all matter at once. Anchor running back builds make intuitive sense in PPR because the very best backs still solve more problems than they create. If you open with Bijan or Gibbs, you've bought weekly volume, receiving access, and a cleaner path through the ugly middle rounds. The trade-off is also obvious. Every early running back pick pushes you into a shallower wide receiver pool, and that can show up later when the WR board turns into specialists and fragile target shares. So the best version of Anchor RB isn't dogmatic. It's taking one true hammer, then using rounds 1 through 4 to lock in 2 or 3 core pieces instead of chasing positional symmetry. McCaffrey is the purest stress test for that idea. If he's healthy, the top 2 case is easy. The role, the offense, and the historical ceiling are all there. The risk case is also grounded, not alarmist. He's 30, he has huge career touch totals, and running backs with repeated massive workloads don't all age gracefully. Offensive line improvement matters here more than people sometimes admit. Better yards before contact can preserve explosiveness and reduce how much juice a back has to create on his own. What it probably can't do is erase age and touch-related fragility, so the balanced conclusion is pretty straightforward. The ceiling argument is better supported than the collapse narrative, but the floor is shakier than a normal first-round superstar. Once you get past the premium backs, the conversation shifts from certainty to asymmetry. Late-round running back targets work when the market is discounting a path to usable volume, not when managers are just collecting random backups and calling it upside. That's why pass catching matters so much. In PPR, a back without a believable receiving role has less margin for error and usually needs touchdowns or an injury ahead of him to matter. Ashton Genty fits the upside template because the workload case is extreme. If that kind of rush share translates, he can produce like a much earlier pick, even if the line isn't perfect. Bucky Irving is the opposite kind of warning. A top 50 price with goal line or touchdown competition baked in can leave you paying for efficiency without actually buying a ceiling. Chase Brown and Kyren Williams are interesting because they sit in the middle. Brown has real red zone evidence and a plausible top 3 outcome if touchdown variance breaks right, but that depends on both scoring luck and Burrow staying upright. Kyren's case is less flashy and maybe more stable. If the workload split stays anywhere near 60-40, and especially if the passing down role holds, the floor is doing a lot of the work there. Best ball and managed leagues need different versions of these bets. In best ball, you can chase spike week chaos. In season long, the safer pass-catching profile usually survives longer. Quarterback pricing is where the market often leaves the cleanest paper trail. Drake May stands out because the gap between ADP and expert rank isn't subtle. When a quarterback with volume upside and better surrounding talent goes multiple rounds after the consensus case, that's exactly the kind of inefficiency worth testing in mocks. Trevor Lawrence is the more complicated version. There are real positives in the profile, especially the rushing contribution and some efficiency growth. But a 6.6% touchdown rate after the bye is the kind of stat that demands skepticism, because rates like that tend to drift back unless something structurally changed. 9 rushing scores matter too, but rushing touchdowns are volatile for most quarterbacks. If both the passing and rushing touchdown pieces normalize together, the ceiling case gets thinner fast. So Lawrence isn't a fade because he's bad. He's a regression watch because last year's fantasy output may have come from the least sticky parts of his profile. Goff and Caleb Williams fit as different long-shot bets. Goff has the durability and yardage history. Caleb has a more fragile weekly floor, but the shootout path is easy to imagine if volume gets forced. At wide receiver, target share still wins arguments, but efficiency can't be dismissed when it starts flashing yellow. That's the Justin Jefferson debate in a sentence. The bounce-back case leans on talent and a still elite share. The caution case points to weaker per-route separation and route win numbers. Those two things can both be true. A receiver can remain heavily featured while also becoming less efficient, and fantasy value depends on which side of that tension moves more. JSN is almost the opposite bet. The appeal is health stability, projected volume, and a realistic route to first-round wide receiver output if the target total really lands where optimists think. Zay Flowers as a round 3 pick feels thinner because the target ceiling looks less secure. Quentin Johnston is more about volatility than trust. Team context matters too. Houston won a lot while being only middling offensively, and that matters for fantasy because a strong defense can support real-life success while quietly capping offensive urgency. The same broader lesson shows up in the AFC South. Division forecasts change fantasy prices. If the Colts underperform expectations or Houston keeps winning with defense-first game scripts, the market can end up overrating names attached to team optimism. The best draft philosophy here is probably the least glamorous one. Take the best talent early, track tier drops, and don't force positional quotas just because your board looks uneven. That sounds simple, but it only works if you actually know what different rooms do. That's where repeated mocks matter more than hot takes. Good draft tools and more realistic bots are useful because they show where ADP diverges from your rankings and how pick position changes the whole running back versus wide receiver puzzle. Mixed ADP collaborative rooms should help too, because platform-specific boards can create fake certainty that disappears in real drafts. And on format, the evidence says full PPR versus half PPR matters less than many managers act like it does. Some players move, but usually not by much. League structure, flex spots, and superflex pressure tend to matter more than obsessing over whether one catch is worth half a point more. That's the board for today. Less hype, more pricing the hidden costs. Thanks for listening to Podkey Fantasy Football. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.